Hello and welcome. Today we begin with the North African nation of Morocco, where the youth has been staging demonstrations on the streets. In a fresh protest, the protesters gathered outside the parliament in the capital of Rabat, seeking reforms, jobs, housing, health, education, and a change of government in the country. The protesters called on the country's prime minister to resign.
The protests were peaceful, as we were demanding our rights in general, such as housing, healthcare, and a decent life. These protests may already be starting to show results, especially since the government has acknowledged that it will take our demands into account and work to improve the situation.
Frankly, we no longer have confidence in the current Akhannouch government. We no longer recognize it as the executive authority of the country. We do not trust it, and we no longer have faith in its decisions or statements, because it is because of its decisions that we have seen people demonstrating to demand their rights, not only in Rabat, but in several cities across the kingdom.
The protests marked the 13th day of Gen Z-led stir across the country, and came ahead of the much-anticipated speech by King Mohammed during the opening of the autumn legislative session.
We are optimistic. We say that the king is the highest authority in Morocco. We hope that he will address us. And even if that doesn't happen tomorrow, I believe there will be arrangements made by him for us. If he doesn't deliver a speech to us tomorrow, that doesn't mean we've been forgotten. On the contrary, I believe he will take our demands into consideration, and we will agree with his decision.
Similar demonstrations have spread through major Moroccan cities, including Casablanca, Fez, and Marrakech. These protests began with tense and chaotic confrontations between the crowds and security forces, and killed at least 3 people and injured hundreds. But now the stir has become more organized and peaceful.
Personally, since the beginning of these protests, we have asked for, and everyone is asking for, a royal speech or royal intervention. We know that under the 2011 Constitution, the king can no longer dismiss the head of government.
But as anger continues, the Moroccan government has renewed calls for dialogue with the youth collective Gen Z 212, leading the agitation. But the collective has refused to relent. In a statement, it demanded a crackdown on corruption and radical modernization of school textbooks. The protesters have also called for improving the health sector. They seek a national plan to renovate hospitals, recruit more doctors and healthcare workers. Morocco's health sector reels under chronic deficits. Despite the government's reforms launched in 2022, access to healthcare in remote areas remains limited. The youth-led protests in Morocco are a part of a broader trend that has gripped several parts of Africa. Similar to the protests that have been ongoing in several African nations, these include Kenya, Nigeria, and most recently in Madagascar. Now, will these protests in Morocco force the government to swing into action? Now, for more on this story, we have with us Megan McDonnell, who is a journalist live from Rabat. Thank you for being with us, Megan.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, what are the main factors driving young Moroccans to protest? And how do these reflect the deeper frustrations within the country's political and economic system?
So as we've stated before, Gen Z 212 has said that their mobilization focuses on 3 principal demands. The first is the dissolution and accountability of the current government, also comprehensive reforms in healthcare and education, and as well the immediate release of detained protesters. The organizers have also noted that these demands these are the frustrations of an entire generation facing chronic unemployment, declining public services, and what they say as a widening gap between the promises of the government and what is the reality of Moroccans.
And given that Morocco is often seen as one of the region's more stable nations, what does this wave of youth-led unrest suggest about changing public sentiment and the government's response?
So I want to start with noting something that was said earlier in your report, which is the truth that these protests, especially within the last few weeks, have shifted in terms of what we are seeing on the ground is peaceful protest. This is a redirection back to the origin of what the Gen Z 212 movement has called for. These protests are gatherings of, up to hundreds to 200 groups spread throughout all of Morocco, with protesters who are not only youth, but also young adults, older people as well, all calling for these similar demands. And in terms of the government response, the biggest shift that we have seen on the ground is that the government is actually, at least in the public eye and to media, acknowledging these demands and saying that they are listening to what the protesters are saying. Specifically, the Minister of Water Equipment, Nizar Baraka, addressed a group of youth in an open debate format on the Deuxième program. And also there has been a wave of other ministers who have talked for TV interviews. So what we're seeing is the government actually talking about, hey, we're seeing your demands and we are addressing these at least to the public eye. However, the Gen Z 212 movement has stressed that they do not want just words. They want actions from the government, and that this dialogue is not going to be enough.
Yeah. And with King Mohammed's annual address coming amid these demonstrations, what specific reforms or policy shifts might the protesters be hoping to influence through their timing and their persistence?
Yes, so the king is going to be addressing the parliament today. This is a much anticipated speech. And essentially, the Gen Z 212 movement, they have actually, their calls are higher than just the government. They are actually calling in an open letter to the king himself. And within these demands, they are calling for the dismissal of the current government under head of government Aziz Akhannouch. There's also a boycott campaign that is going on against Akhannouch's businesses as well. There's also a launch of impartial judicial proceedings. They're also calling for a dissolution of political parties that they found complicit in corruption, as well as a few other demands, with also notably the release of detainees linked to peaceful protest. And they stress the distinction between legitimate demonstrators and those involved in acts of violence or vandalism. So essentially what these youth are hoping for is that the king is going to address some of these demands, and not only for them, but for the prosperity of the Moroccan people.
Right. Megan, thank you so much for being with us on Firstpost Africa.
Thank you.
Want the facts?
The latest developments?
News that gets straight to the point.
Well, we've got all three just for you. This is Firstpost Live, a brand new show, your window into what really matters.
Don't miss it.